Okay, my friends, is our last practice DBQ. I think at this point I can go through pretty quick, especially because World War II is so fresh with us. Just going to talk a little bit about what we could do with these documents. So the prompt says, to a greater or lesser extent, three factors were involved in explaining U.S. response to Japanese and German aggression: economics, national security, and democratic values. Drawing upon the documents as well as your knowledge of history, analyze the extent to which these factors influenced U.S. foreign policy from 37 to 41. And as you look at that first document there, because remember, in 1938, what are we in? Like, that's the mini Great Recession. And here we have, Roosevelt very cautiously starting to increase defense spending. And here we have a report that, okay, this is pushing prices up because, again, what's our biggest word in economics? Expectations, right? That there are going to be there's going to be future spending by the government. As Roosevelt had sort of shifted the spending in New Deal programs to more spending to try and prepare should the United States find itself at war with Germany. And also, you'll see all of these documents more or less deal with more directly with Germany. You can certainly include all sorts of things with Japan as well. As keep in mind, this is after the invasion of mainland China and the Panay incident as well. Here we have, an advertisement that's taken out in the New York Times, and this is June. This is the Battle of France is over, right? This is right after Dunkirk. This is, Churchill's speech, of never surrender, and it's saying that here we have to defeat these forces because they are enemies of democracy. This is at a point, again, where France had surrendered and the British Expeditionary Force had just been withdrawn from Dunkirk. So despite the defeats by what would become the Allied powers, this is saying our only shot of keeping any security at home is keeping these democracies in Europe. Wendell Willkie, right? So he's running against Roosevelt, basically opposing him as a third termer. But as you can see, here he is. It's clear the aggression by the Japanese in the Pacific and the war in Europe with Nazi Germany. Here he comes out and says that he's coming out in favor of the Selective Service Act, which was passed in early 1940, right? And saying we can't have Britain lose. If Britain loses and doesn't control the Atlantic, because again, this is right after we had the basis for destroyers deal. This is before the Lend-Lease Act. That's in March of 1941. And saying, here we need trade. We need trade with Great Britain. We need trade with France. And if Germany controls the ocean, that's a big part of our economy. That trade is out. So Willkie agreed with Roosevelt that we needed to be prepared, and you see that here. But you also see him mentioning the economic necessity of keeping that trade open. I just had to take a picture of this. I couldn't find it online, and I can't find a date. I think this was a really bad DBQ in that they didn't give a date. But it's clear. I mean, everybody in a kindergartner knows that the Great Depression doesn't end until the government spending of World War II, right? And here you can see the idea being that as we spend money on weapons, what comes out the other end is economic recovery. As, again, the government did spend its way out of the Great Depression as unemployment is basically gone as a problem by 1942. We had just talked about in our review the Four Freedoms speech. This is where Roosevelt says that we are going to become the arsenal of democracy. Again, we have been pushed in the Pacific by Japan, although their worst actions are going to come in 1941. And Britain is hanging on. They would have just had the Blitz, right, throughout September of 1940. And this is his introduction to, we'll become the great arsenal of democracy. We are going to help the democratic countries around the world. And this is his pitch for the Lend-Lease Act, where we will be giving supplies to defend Great Britain. I think there's a typo in this because this should say corporate profits after taxes. And you can see the massive increase as we had government spending for defense before we joined the war and the massive recovery that it promoted. And you can see that it also provided a lot of tax revenue for the US government as well. 1941, of course, this number goes up so much. 1939, we've gone to cash and carry, bases for destroyers, and now we have the Lend-Lease Act. And you can see how that has promoted economic recovery. And then finally, here's Charles Lindbergh, which talks about, the idea that we need to prepare for an invasion, but fighting against the idea of becoming involved in another European war. And keep in mind, in 1941, this is where we really get on a war footing with Japan because of taking over French Indonesia and Malaya, and it becomes clear at this point that there is going to be a war with Japan. So, this is a weird question. You would never get anything even close to it. And it's a weird way for them to ask about World War II. But I just wanted to use it to pick apart some of the documents and show you how to put them in some context and to see some important things that come out. And I figure at this point, I could go with something that was a lot shorter for you. Okay?